I offer the reading this morning as a sign of solidarity with our Muslim friends and neighbors in this time of great sorrow. On Friday at 1 p.m., I invite any of you to join me and other faith leaders in the city in forming a ring of peace around the Islamic Information and Dawah Center on Bloor West. There's information in this week's First Light if you'd like to join us. Our reading is by the Palestinian-American poet Naomi Shihab Nye. It's called Different Ways to Pray. There was the method of kneeling, a fine method if you lived in a country where stones were smooth. The women dreamed wistfully of bleached courtyards, hidden corners where knee fit rock. Their prayers were weathered rib bones, small calcium words uttered in sequence, as if this shedding of syllables could somehow fuse them to the sky. There were the men who had been shepherds so long they walked like sheep. Under the olive trees they raised their arms. Hear us, we have pain on earth. We have so much pain there is no place to store it. But the olives bobbed peacefully in fragrant buckets of vinegar and thyme. At night the men ate heartily, flat bread and white cheese, and were happy in spite of the pain, because there was also happiness. Some prized the pilgrimage, wrapping themselves in new white linen to ride buses across miles of vacant sand. When they arrived at Mecca, they would circle the holy places on foot many times. They would bend knee to kiss the earth and return, their lean faces housing mystery. While for certain cousins and grandmothers, the pilgrimage occurred daily, lugging water from the spring or balancing the baskets of grapes. These were the ones present at births, humming quietly to perspiring mothers. The ones stitching intricate needlework into children's dresses, forgetting how easily children soil clothes. There were those who didn't care about praying, the young ones, the ones who had been to America. They told the old ones, "You are wasting your time." The old ones prayed for Allah to mend their brains, for the twig, for the round moon to speak suddenly in a commanding tone. And occasionally there would be one who did none of this. The old man Fauzi, for example, Fauzi the fool, who beat everyone at dominoes, insisted he spoke with God as he spoke with goats, and was famous for his laugh. Let us join now in singing hymn 123. There's an old Hasidic story that tells of three rabbis who were in a huge hurry to reach their destination before sunset on the Sabbath. Riding through darkening and dreary woods, they heard the sound of singing. As they got closer to the sound, they saw a young boy dressed in rags, filthy and malnourished, dancing and singing at the top of his lungs. Astonished, one of the rabbis asked the boy, "Why are you so joyful?" "Because I'm lost in the woods," he yelled, while still singing and dancing. "And why are you dancing?" asked another. "Because I'm hungry and scared." Now, as you might imagine, the rabbis were confused. Surely anyone lost and hungry in the woods would not be singing for joy, but crying out in fear. But at that point, the boy turned to the esteemed rabbis to explain. "My teachers, I have been lost in these woods for 3 days, without food and braving the cold and wild animals. For the first 2 days, I was very scared. I cried out in hunger and fear. And then this morning, I woke up and thought, I am hungry and I am cold and I am scared. And that means I am still alive and happy to be here." And with that, he started to dance and sing some more. As the Sufi poet Rumi put it, there are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground. We could add that there are countless ways to give thanks and praise for all that is our life, that there are endless opportunities with the rising of the sun each day to lift our hearts in gratitude for what is, sometimes even when it is more than we can seemingly bear. Through the mundane and the unexpected, life bids us, when we are awake to it, to utter a word of thanks, to offer a prayer of gratitude for the miracle and majesty of it all, to feel deep in our bones that we are inexplicably part of the marvelous unfolding of the universe, a gift for which our hearts might resound with ceaseless thanksgiving. And yet, I can't imagine that a single one of us, myself very much included, does this with the dedication that the great gift of our life merits. We forget. We fail to notice. We can't be bothered. The only prayer on our lips, if there is one at all, is a half-hearted meh. And yet, as the parent of any small child can tell you, forcing someone to say thank you does not instill a genuine feeling of gratitude. The feeling, the unbidden prayer, if you will, has to come from somewhere else, and it has to be felt naturally. Friedrich Schleiermacher, the founder of liberal theology, speculated at the turn of the 19th century that religious experience is rooted in our emotional center, creating within us a feeling of absolute dependence, a dependence, he said, we felt toward what he called the eternal or God. In 1799, he wrote a book for his non-religious friends called On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. These were people who had rejected religious teachings and were living very secular lives. These were the religiously unaffiliated of their time. In the book to these cosmopolitan skeptical friends, he argued, "You have succeeded in making your earthly lives so rich and many-sided that you no longer need the eternal. You have made your earthly lives so rich and many-sided that you no longer need the eternal." Does that sound like anyone you know? What I hear him taking his friends to task for is an arrogance grown out of a mistaken sense of self-sufficiency, for thinking themselves wholly independent, rather than seeing that they, and we with them, rely on the grace of a million other ordinary things in order to survive. Our seventh principle calls us to live with respect for the interdependent web of life of which we are a part. It is a radical theological statement, at odds with much of human history for the past 3,000 years. For much of the Western world, especially that steeped in the Abrahamic traditions, there's been a strong belief that humans were placed above the created order, in a separate place, somehow outside the web. The book of Genesis says as much. Humans were made to rule over the other creatures, it says. But indigenous and other earth-based traditions have seen it differently and have seen it as it truly is. That we are inextricably bound up with everything else, that our life, that our being, that our well-being is part of the whole of life and is absolutely dependent upon a vast web of being beyond ourselves. Some call that web the eternal, others God. There is no shortage of names. But by whatever name you call it, such an understanding of life requires great humility, and it calls for deep gratitude. There are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground, and there are countless ways to give thanks. And yet, if we are not feeling it, what are we to do? I believe we are to practice until we do feel it. This mostly involves learning to simply pay attention. The week before last, at the end of my study leave, I was on a silent retreat in an Anglican monastery down in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I have long-standing connections with the community there going back to the 90s and my days in university when I met with one of the brothers for spiritual direction. Now, amid the noise of the world of late, I found myself craving silence. By the time I got to the monastery, I was ready to be still and enter into the kind of reflection and discernment I think is only available when we have slowed down long enough to listen. Over the days I was there, I kept the schedule of the monks. 5 times a day, I participated in the worship life of the community with services starting at dawn and the last ending just before bed. The chapel bell would ring and I would be off with the brothers and the others on retreat to sit in the silence of an ice-cold church and chant ancient psalms. I tried really to love it very hard. I did. But I found it excruciating, at least for the first couple of days. Of course, there were my strong theological objections to almost everything. Each service involved chanting 4 or 5 of the Psalms, many of which are profoundly problematic. And some of them are really long, especially when you are already shivering. And the monks in this monastery, as lovely and as loving as they are, chant at a snail's pace. Between each line of the text, they take a grand pause of several seconds. And after a few days, I came to love this. It didn't matter what we were chanting anymore. It was the ritual, the practice, the habit of slowing down and breathing that made all the difference. Being caught up in the prayer life of the monks started to spill over into other parts of my day as I began to notice things, to see what I hadn't or couldn't before. Twice a day, I would sit for an extended time of meditation and prayer in my own room, looking out the window to the cloister below and the Charles River beyond the wall. I took in the dappled sunlight on the trees. I watched the veneer of ice actually melt on the river. I gave myself the gift of watching without time constraints, without a pull to do anything else, as 2 swans ate their breakfast, their regal heads plunging below the frigid waters again and again. The words of Mary Oliver's poem, "How I Go to the Woods," resonated deeply for me in those moments. She writes, "Ordinarily, I go to the woods alone, with not a single friend, for they are all smilers and talkers and therefore unsuitable. I don't really want to be witnessed talking to the catbirds or hugging the old black oak tree. I have my way of praying as you no doubt have yours. Besides, when I am alone, I can become invisible. I can sit on the top of a dune as motionless as an uprise of weeds until the foxes run by unconcerned. I can hear the almost unhearable sound of the roses singing. If you have ever gone to the woods with me, I must love you very much. Indeed. For such stillness is an all too rare gift in this crowded life that we lead. But there in my room, or walking along the river in the late afternoon, or chanting in the cold church, I felt myself a part of it all, and in my heart I experienced an outpouring of gratitude. And if I'm honest, I also felt grief, that the pace of my life, that the pace of our lives, doesn't often allow us to study the blessings that abound at every turn, that we live in a way that makes it hard to kneel and kiss the ground as often as we might. Perhaps that is why the 13th century monk and mystic Meister Eckhart said that if the only prayer you say in your entire life is thank you, that it would suffice. Perhaps that's because sometimes it may just have to. And yet I think we can hope for better. I think we can hope for more intention, more attention, more connection to the source of all that sustains us. My colleague Galen Gingrich, the minister at All Souls Unitarian in Manhattan, has advanced the notion that gratitude is the defining practice of what it means to be a UU. He explains that for Jews, the defining discipline is obedience. To be a faithful Jew is to obey the commands of God. For Christians, the defining discipline is love. To be a faithful Christian is to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. For Muslims, the defining discipline is submission. To be a faithful Muslim is to submit to the will of Allah. And what of us, he asks? What should be our defining religious discipline? He says it should be gratitude. He reasons that a discipline of gratitude reminds us of how utterly dependent we are on the people and the world around us for everything that matters. And from this, he says, flows an ethic of gratitude that obligates us to create a future that justifies an increasing sense of gratitude for the human family as a whole. This ethic of gratitude demands that we nurture the world that nurtures us in return. To make gratitude a spiritual practice requires discipline, a commitment to humility, a willingness to return again and again to the understanding that our fragile existence is related to that of everything else. It doesn't require living life as a monk, thankfully, but it does invite us into a rhythm of mindfulness that helps us to behold and respond to the blessings that make up our life. While this may often need to be a solitary pursuit, there is certainly something to be said for also doing it in community. Earlier in my study leave, I spent a week with 6 of my classmates from seminary. Starting this group was the smartest thing that I did in div school. We have met monthly now for 14 years, and once every year or so, we gather for a week-long retreat. This is the most important thing that I do related to my ongoing professional development and well-being in ministry. We challenge and console and inspire one another, and we have fun. Toward the end of our time together, we took a boat out to the Channel Islands off the coast of California near where we were gathered. We hiked across the small island called Anacapa, reaching an outlook aptly named Inspiration Point. There's a photo I snapped on the cover of your order of service. It is literally Land's End, as the outcroppings from the sea taper off into water. To one side, there is only open ocean between this point and Antarctica. As the 7 of us stood there taking in the vast scene, one of our group recited the first line of E. E. Cummings' great hymn of gratitude. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day. After a couple of beats of silence, another person added the next line, and then someone added the next. On it went, the group of us conjuring this great prayer of thanksgiving together. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I, who have died, am alive again today, and this is the sun's birthday. This is the birthday of life and of love and wings, and of the gay great happening illimitably earth. How should tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing, any lifted from the know of all nothing, human, merely being, doubt unimaginable you? Now the ears of my ears awake, and now the eyes of my eyes are opened. At the end of this prayer, we stood in silence for a very long time, just taking in the scene. Life endlessly offers us such moments, be they grand or small, if and when we pay attention. Individually or together, whether we draw on the words of the poets or are moved to speak within the silence of our own heart, let us all become people of gratitude. Let us kneel often to kiss the ground, and may the prayer found on our lips ever be one of thanks.